Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight, once again, we're on the road. We are sitting here in the Drop-In Center for the National Alliance for Mental Illness here in Oak Park, Illinois, NAMI for short. And we're sitting here with Jason Allington, a board member of NAMI, a longtime consumer of NAMI services, and a stand-up comedian and a book author.
Yes.
That's pretty good.
Well, that's you got to keep busy, right?
Well, Jason, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk a little bit about NAMI and what it is and why it's important to you. And
Sure.
We'll go into a couple of other things as well. But tell us just a little bit about what NAMI is.
NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, is an international organization of support for people living in recovery with mental illness in their lives. So it's adults 18 and over. The programs are geared around about three different ideas. One is ending the stigma around mental illness, education, advocacy, providing direct support for people in the community with mental illness, and for their families. Often an overlooked area is the family support. So there's educational programs, there's direct support programs, job placement programs, and there's so much here for people living really with a very difficult situation.
I hadn't thought about the family aspect of it, but sure, mental illness affects everyone in the family.
Right, very much so.
I would think especially if it comes up and it hasn't been there before, as I know at least some forms of mental illness come about, for instance, in adolescence or maybe later in life, and suddenly things are turned upside down.
Right, yeah, sure. And the families don't know how to react. I mean, we don't go to school and learn how to manage a relation with mental illness, and it's tricky. I volunteer at the McNeil Hospital and speak to individuals in recovery, and I'd say more than half of them don't have what they would call a supportive environment back home.
And how does NAMI try to correct that problem?
One of the programs that we do here at NAMI is called Family to Family, and it's a 12-week structured program for family members to come, and it's built around the idea of training you about the illness that your loved one is dealing with. And this could be parents, this could be siblings, spouses, children of the person that is struggling. And it educates them on, what is this illness that they're dealing with? How is it affecting them? What are the medications? What does the recovery process look like? What are the resources NAMI has? And make them feel better about what they can do for their
And you
loved
talked
one.
earlier about the stigma with mental illness as well.
Yes.
And I would assume that's part of the family counseling as well, correct?
It's a big part of it. And the stigma is one of the, mental illness is still one of those things that we bury in society. It's not talked about, amongst friends. You don't go to cocktail parties and talk about bipolar disorder. It just doesn't come up.
Which is ironic because, especially when you get to my age, and you get together people and say, "Oh man, my back is a wreck, and I'm getting a knee replacement, next week." Yeah. But no one will ever mention something about mental illness.
Yeah, it's still kind of an cover, something we keep hidden away in the attic, right?
And why do we think that is? I mean, why was this singled out as something that had to be hidden? Although I will say also there was a time when cancer was something you didn't talk about.
Exactly right.
So is it seen as a failing of the individual, or something to be ashamed of rather than something just to be dealt with?
Something to be ashamed of. I think it's different for the different types of mental illness. For depression, which is the one that I know about most intimately, the stigma might be around, well, just get over it. We all get depressed. Get over it. It's going to be fine. The trick and part of the reason behind the stigma is mental illness is seen as something that you can just take care of. Just get over it.
Oh, you can do it yourself.
Yeah.
Real men don't need help.
Of course. That's for sure. Although plenty of women are struggling with it, and they're stigmatized just as badly as men. It's because you can't see it. It's not a broken bone. It's not a chronic illness that has been known about for a long time. Like diabetes is a perfect example. That nobody says to a diabetic, "Get over it," right? Of course, you need medication. You're in recovery. You have to watch what you eat. Society knows how to deal with that, and we're not afraid to talk about it. These are all things, though, as you mentioned. We used to not talk about cancer. It used to be, we whisper about it, and it's just, I think it's one of the last things that we have to cope with as a society and really embrace and start treating mental illness as a physical illness with environmental factors that it
and something that can be treated and
Yes.
and handled.
Absolutely. Right.
So you talked about your own experience, and,
Yeah.
and we had talked a little before the show about your own experience with depression.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating story, and without probing too deeply into dark corners, I'd like to know a little bit more about when it first hit you and how you recognized what it was.
Sure. In looking back over my life, it occurs to me that right around the age of 14 or 15, as puberty was rearing its ugly head, I started to have very dark thoughts about my life and about myself. And they would sneak in, and the theme was suicide. Taking my own life was just because I was a bad person, that there's something wrong with me, that I don't deserve to be around, that the world would be better off without me. And this could be spurred by a small incident. Maybe somebody looked at me the wrong way at school, or I got a bad grade on a test, or the girl I asked to prom didn't say yes, those kind of things. That would the self-talk would be, of course she said no, you're
not
worthless.
deserving.
You're not
Yeah.
deserving. You're you know, it'll all be better when you're gone. And that sat with me. That was part of my daily self-talk every day.
Now, as an adolescent, I mean, I know all adolescents go through difficult times.
Yeah, right.
And it's also the time when these young, almost adults, are trying to break loose from their parents, recognizing themselves as individuals.
Right.
So why, well, I get the impression you didn't talk to your parents or to your siblings or family or probably even friends. So why not? What prevented you from doing that?
That's a great question. A few things prevented me from talking about it. One was I thought that everybody had these feelings, and we just didn't talk about them because it wasn't polite conversation. That's the most benign reason, right? Another reason was that I was a guy, and this was about my feelings, and
Guys don't talk
we don't
about
talk about
their
our feelings. And amongst each other, we don't talk about our feelings. And our private conversations have nothing to do with our feelings. It's about everything else.
Sports.
Sports.
Which girl
girls,
go to the prom with, right?
That kind of thing. And another reason was I felt ashamed about the way that I felt. And part of the reason why, and I'm not blaming her for this, my mother was a type 1 diabetic. She was diagnosed when I was born with type 1 diabetes and was insulin dependent, and I grew up seeing her struggle with this. And she never complained once in her life that I could see about her disease. Never, as I was watching her body fail her with this chronic illness, which is horrible, never did she get down, never did she exhibit any self-pity. It was just something she dealt with.
She was the stoic.
She was the stoic one.
Motor through
And
it.
she was a great inspiration for me for that reason, and somebody that I looked up to enormously for her strength and her courage and her, she didn't like. I remember her. She went to a support group once for people living with diabetes, and she said when she came back, she said, "I'm never going to that again." All they said was, "Well, why me? Why me?" And she said, "Well, why not you? If not you, then who? Why me? That's a worthless thing to think about. There's no point in thinking about that." And that was, so
Though there's
that's
some
positive.
But there's validity in that, yeah.
Oh, there's enormous amount of
look,
validity
we all
to
get
it.
dealt a hand,
Yeah.
and some of us get a bad hand, some of us get a good hand.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is some value in saying just not self-pity, right?
Yeah. The self-pity thing is something she had no patience for, and I
Absorb that.
I absorbed it, and I took that as a value. Self-pity is not something to have. And I looked at her and thought, I just feel bad about myself and I want to die. My mom has a real sickness, and she never gets down about it, never complains. What kind of a jerk would I have to be to complain about my feelings when my mom is here dealing with something real? Right?
Yeah.
That was a big part of it. And again, not to blame my mom. Of course, this is the thinking of a sick mind going on here.
No, but I can see that kind of rationality. Not even necessarily a sick mind, just an adolescent mind.
Yes.
Especially who's seen this role model
Yeah.
of, and you're 15, 16, you're trying to model yourself on this, either consciously or subconsciously. So that seems like the most natural thing in the world to take that approach.
And I was on the external side, a very, very fortunate person. I had a loving, my parents stayed together, which was, notable back in the 70s when I was growing up. And I had a good set of friends. I did well at school. I went to a good school. I got tall pretty early, so I was never really picked on. I didn't have any of the bullying challenges that a lot of kids had. I was smart. I was funny. I was a class clown. And we live in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. I mean, I look at that and knowing that, even then, knowing that and looking at it, made me think, if you can, you're one of the fortunate 0.1% people in the world living the life that you have.
Appreciate
the fact that you can't get
over
just
this
simple pleasure out of that. You're clearly sick. Not. I didn't even think sick. I thought worthless. You're worthless.
It's how ungrateful am I?
Exactly. Yeah. How ungrateful am I? That's a good way to put it.
So, when did you recognize that this actually was an illness?
Gosh, I didn't acknowledge it as an illness for quite some time. I did see a couple of therapists over the years. So I went to, when I was in college, I had a girlfriend who died in a car crash. And
well, that would mess with your brain.
Yeah,
sure.
Which was very, very bad. And I tried to see a therapist then, and they couldn't get me in. It was in college. They couldn't get me in time. So I said, well, screw it. I'm not going to go do that. When I started to work full-time jobs and we had insurance and I could see a therapist, I tried a therapist a couple of times. Never told the therapists that I saw that I had any suicidal thoughts. I did talk about feeling depressed, feeling down. One of them put me on a medication for a brief period of time, but I just thought, I remember thinking, I don't need this. I don't need this therapy. I don't need this This is what friends are for. You talk to friends about these things. You don't need to go to a doctor to talk about these things.
Well, I'm also surprised that they didn't, if you had mentioned that you were depressed, that they didn't ask you, have you ever had suicidal thoughts?
It's entirely possible that they did ask that question, and I dodged it or lied about it. Yeah, probably the most likely the case. So I sat on these feelings throughout college. I lived in Los Angeles for a few years. I got a film degree from school, so the most unemployable major from the University of Michigan where I went. And then
English literature is equally unemployable, just so you know.
Good to know. Yes. Good to know. And then I went to LA for 3 years and didn't like LA. Knew that wasn't for me, so I left there and moved to Chicago. I got married when I moved to Chicago, and we had 3 kids. Got a nice house in Oak Park. Everything but the white picket fence. I mean, all the trappings of the American dream. I was gathering onto myself. I was making good money in sales. I was selling advertising, internet advertising back in the early days, which paid stupid money and was a great place and a fun place to be. So I had, I kept trying to, because I was having these suicidal thoughts daily. They were part of my
every day
daily routine. I would go to sleep at night, and part of my routine was to think about, to add layers to my fantasy, my plan.
The plan to
kill yourself. To kill myself, exactly. And it became almost like a teddy bear for me, like a comfort, and it became a plan B. It became, if things ever get bad enough, I've always got this thing I can do. And I wasn't raised religious, so I didn't have any feelings of sin or any of that complication with it. This was just something that some people do. And I didn't attach any shame to suicide. I just thought, if it gets bad enough, I can do this. No, I had 3 little kids, and all the trappings of success. And every time I had one of my children was born, I thought, this will be the time. I'll get real happiness here. This is going to be. And surely, I did experience enormous happiness, and I felt my self-talk went from feeling incredibly lucky to incredibly unworthy
of this great good fortune that had befallen you.
And when I get recognition on the job at work, I always felt the sinking suspicion in the back of my mind was always, when are they going to catch on? You know, when are they going to get wise to what I really am?
Well, now, part of that is, I think, what is referred to as the imposter syndrome that many of us suffer from.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, so I don't want people, I wouldn't want people to think, gee, I have that same imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you're suicidal or that you need this kind of intervention that you eventually got. But still, I can understand where you would use because everything would then be self-reinforcing about how awful you were.
It was feeding the self-talk is what that all did. So I'm living with the feelings. I'm not getting help for them. I'm not talking to my wife. I'm not talking to friends and family. I never told anybody about these thoughts, ever. And by the time I'm 40 years old, I've been married for several years. I have 3 little kids at home and a nice house and a nice job. And a series of things happened. My mother, who was living with diabetes, died. She finally succumbed at the age of 62. And died from a heart attack ultimately. And that was devastating. It was something I knew was coming. I had been warming up for that phone call for years and years and years.
But it still hits hard.
It still hits hard, yeah. And if you've been through that.
My parents are both gone, and so yes, no matter how prepared you are.
It's not something you can be ready for, right?
Yeah, it hits you.
So that was devastating. Then my father, and no fault of his, but he didn't know how to live alone. And he started dating right away, went online and started. Now, they'd been married for 50 years, for 40 years.
40 years.
And they, they were very young when they got married. So he had never lived alone. He didn't know how to be alone. And he was living by himself in South Carolina, where they had retired to. And he brought, a few months after my mom died, came up for a visit and brought a woman that he'd started seeing. And she was a nightmare, right? She was a nightmare. And she could have been Mother Teresa, and I wouldn't have liked her, though, right? It wouldn't have been enough.
Sure.
But I did not like her at all. And it made me angry at him and angry at her, and that was bad. This was October of 2007. If you recall that time period, things didn't get much better.
The economy was about to tank.
Went deep south.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, my house was worth less than I owed on it. I sold advertising for a living, and businesses were cutting their ad budgets.
Oh, and especially internet advertising that dried up.
Well, there were actually 2 big drops that happened. Yeah, there was one in 2000 and another one in 2007 where sort of the rug was pulled out from the entire industry. So I wasn't making as much money. So really, for the first time as a grown-up, I was struggling with real financial difficulties, right? And my sickness got to the point, my self-talk started to entertain the idea of Plan B.
Because now there was objective evidence that you'd screwed up,
right? Oh, I made some bad decisions here. I bought too big a house.
I should have known better.
I should have known better. Anyway, so over the months, and a number of other small things occurred, but I did make a decision one Sunday night that I was going to take my life the next day. So I went to bed at night, knowing the next day I was going to go and take care of business.
And how did you feel on Sunday night? Was this
euphoric?
I ask that question because I have talked with other people who've been through this, and that is a common theme.
Yeah.
Because it's the euphoria that I can end this right now. I'm going to do it. It's here. It's open to me. Yeah. All I have to do is just carry through the plan. And it seems.
It's counterintuitive.
Yes, if I hadn't heard it from other sources, I would have had the same reaction. Like, are you crazy?
Yeah, right. Euphoric.
But yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, that night and the day that followed, leading up to my attempt, I was the happiest I'd been in 25 years, and a skip in my step, if you will. Truly euphoric. And I have talked to my doctors about this since then, and what they tell me is that the euphoria is partly tied to a release of endorphins, of dopamine and such, that occurs when you make a decision, a big, important decision. And that can be a positive decision or a negative decision, but you're lifting the burden of indecision off of yourself. That's releasing positive hormones, releasing positive feelings, and that's causes a euphoria. And that's exactly what that was. That's exactly what was happening. And I had a view of the end.
And it must also reinforce the decision, right? Oh, this is clearly the right decision.
Oh, yeah, because I feel so good about it. Yeah. Oh, my gosh. And everybody's going to be better off. Everybody's going to, and this is, I speak at the hospitals, at McNeil Hospital in particular, to patients that are at the bottom and dealing with the beginning of recovery, and I tell them about the lie that we tell ourselves, right? That the world would be better off without me. I was convinced. You could not have talked to me if you had met me on that Monday and said,
you're wrong about that.
Yeah, and just said you're wrong about it. I'm going to show you why you're wrong, A, B, C, D. I would have said,
even It's a Wonderful Life. I mean,
yeah, right, exactly.
That kind of examination might not have been enough, right?
Exactly. And you couldn't have convinced me. And that lie is what feeds a lot of folks that are dealing with this illness, that people are better. I was certain. Big insurance payout for my wife, right? Kids will be taken care of as far as school and everything, and they won't have my awful influence in their lives. And I didn't really think I thought I was a good dad, but I knew there was something wrong with me.
Yeah.
And it needed to be removed from
And
the
it
kids.
would rub off on them if you weren't careful.
Yeah, right. And people are catching on. Hey, we're facing financial ruin. 3 little kids in a big house.
Well, this also, it answers a question that I've heard from others when have had these discussions, and that is that there's a reaction from people who are outside looking in to say, well, what a selfish decision.
Yes.
How could you possibly do that and not think about the effect it would have on your kids, your wife, your job, whatever else? But in listening to you, your understanding at the time was, I'm doing them a favor. This isn't selfish.
Yeah.
They're going to love this because this is the right answer.
Right.
And I think that's just, it's
indicative of the illness to a large degree of depression, is the inability to see that side of it. I think back now about if I had been successful, and I'm mortified, and that's probably the wrong word because it's got death tied to the front end of it, but
horrified.
I'm horrified
Yeah.
that I could have been successful and left my kids without a dad and left my wife without a husband. And that would have devastated them. Not only would that have devastated them, it's something that we know about, mental illness passes down generation to generation. But when you introduce suicide into a family like this, the chances of one of my 3 kids doing it go up exponentially.
Really? I did not know that.
Because it's as though you've presented by doing it myself. First of all, I've devastated them in a way they were all too young to understand. And I've introduced suicide as a viable option into the home, into the family.
So once again, it's a role model thing.
Yeah.
You've played out the role.
And it happens to a lot of people. I mean, and so we've had, my wife and I have kept a very close eye on our kids while they're growing up, and, at every sign. Something a lot of people don't know, and your viewers, it would be great information. If you have any concerns about mental illness for your kids, pediatricians understand how to screen children of any age for early signs of mental illness with simple questions that they can ask in an exam.
But they wouldn't unless the parents had brought it up,
Correct.
right?
That's correct. Yeah.
So the parents need to understand, and if they have any suspicion, tell the pediatrician.
Yeah, go ahead and ask these questions. And certainly we immediately, when I started recovery, got with our pediatrician and explained the situation. And
so again, this is a question you don't have to answer, but were you unsuccessful because you changed your mind at the end, or was it just the attempt wasn't well executed? I had the wrong word. Didn't mean it that way. But
I'm going to work that into my bit
you
for the routine. It was, I don't know how much, I go into great detail when I speak at the hospital about the night. The method was, I took an overdose of aspirin. I took 50 crushed up aspirin, a bottle of red wine, a bottle of 30 Ambien, and razor blades in a bathtub. And it was the initial attempt. So the thought was aspirin would thin my blood, I'd bleed to death quickly and fall asleep and die quietly. That was my plan, and be at peace. And I did plenty of all of those things. I did plenty of, lost a good amount of blood, and I lost consciousness for 9 hours and woke up later that night in the hospital bed, not quite sure where I was, very weak, with my ears ringing, and slowly came to the realization of where I was, what I was doing. And many thoughts went through my head, but I ultimately decided to go back and finish the job. And I won't go into all the details, but I continued to try where I left off. And at a certain point, a voice said to me, this is one of those memories that I guess I'm not supposed to die today, was the phrase that came into my head. And there's a lot of ideas about where those words came from. Yeah. And I got out of the tub and I called the front desk of the hotel and told them what happened, and they came and got me. So it was a failed attempt because I wasn't supposed to die. That's why I didn't die. I tried. I made a great effort, and it didn't work.
Was it at that point that you decided then that it was time to seek your own help? And was it that when you connected with NAMI, or was it a series of events?
I immediately went to the hospital. I went to be physically repaired. I met a doctor. The first person I met when I got admitted was a psychiatrist. The first actual psychiatrist I'd ever met. 40 years old, 25 years of suicidal thoughts. My first psychiatrist. And he was a guardian angel type of figure for me, because he explained what was wrong with me very quickly. You have depression. You've had it for a very long time. And he said, Jason, I've just met you, but I know you've had it for a very long time, because people that haven't don't do what you just did. Yeah. So it was pretty obvious to him.
Right.
And then he said, you're going to be taking medication for the rest of your life, which is something I resisted in the past. I don't like taking medicine.
It's a crutch. I don't need that.
It's a crutch. I don't need it. And there can't, that's not, that's not going to help. But he said, it will help. It will not help right away. It'll take some time to work. And we might not get the mix right the first time through. We might have to make some changes. But he said, he gave me a vision to hang on to. He said, it's going to be a day you'll be walking around anywhere, somewhere. And it's going to feel like a veil has been lifted off of your eyes. And you'll be seeing the world in a new way for the first time.
And did that, in fact, happen?
That, in fact, happened about 3 months in. I had that moment, and it couldn't have been more out of a Disney movie if I tried. I was walking in a park, and
the sun was shining?
It went to Technicolor. I mean, I noticed the beauty of the world in a way that I had never noticed before. And I appreciated the value of life in a way that I never had before. And that's something that, first of all, that vision kept me going, right, in the first months of recovery, because it's very hard. That vision, and then support, working with NAMI on support, coming in for support for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Those support groups helped me enormously, and then medicine kicked in. My psychiatrist, when I got home, hooked me up, and it's a long ride. I've been on taking medicine for 11 years.
So how important is the NAMI role? I mean, the support group you just mentioned, you said it's very helpful. So how does that play into the overall recovery effort? Yeah,
it was instrumental at the beginning of my recovery. So when I left the psychiatric hospital, the doctor that had been seeing me there, and I skipped some of this. I went from the medical hospital to a psychiatric facility for 4 days and got lots of therapy. And when I left, the doctor gave me a pamphlet that included information about NAMI.
And it's right here in your backyard.
And the way he put it to me was very, very good too. He said, Jason, it's easy in here. It's easy in here in the hospital because nobody judges you. You feel safe. You can take the mask off. You leave your mask at the door, right? And that was really, the days in the hospital were the best 4 days of my life up until that point, because I had never spoken to anybody without that mask in 25 years. This is the
first time that you've been able to do it.
Exactly.
And it wasn't that false euphoria of making the decision to kill yourself. Now this was the real thing.
This was the real thing. This was a reaffirmation of life, a reaffirmation of my feelings, understanding that I wasn't alone. Big part of it, that I wasn't alone. And what NAMI did for me was, this doc said, it's safe in the hospital. When you get out, it's not safe anymore. Here are some places to go. And what NAMI gave me a couple of things right out of the gate. A place to be, a place to hang out, where I could relax and know I wasn't being looked at, wasn't being judged, wasn't being looked at funny. And then it also gave me the ability to meet other people that were in recovery and learn from them, learn coping mechanisms, learn about just skills for getting through the day-to-day life. And I acutely needed that help at the beginning.
Jason, I want to thank you for this conversation.
Oh,
I mean, I
my pleasure.
hope that I haven't probed too deeply and made you uncomfortable.
Not at all.
But it's been fascinating to me, and I'm hoping people who watch this will be similarly affected and draw some strength from what you've had to say. But we're actually out of time, so we're going to wrap up.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Yeah. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, or see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.
We are for each other, must be for each other. Everyone's my brother, my father's sister, mother.